In this tutorial, we are going to go over the basic concepts of Unreal's game mode, character controller, and pawn. So let's just start out here on Paint so we can kind of illustrate these concepts. Unreal has something called a game mode. The game mode is responsible for kind of telling us what the rules of the games are, or the rules of the game is. This could be things like the player's respawn logic. When the player dies, where do they respawn? It could be the time limit of the game. It could be the point limit of the game. It also handles some of the common UI that might be shared among players. If you think of a multiplayer game, for example, a scoreboard is something all the players need to see. Usually that's handled in the game mode, a lot of that. You can really think of the game mode as like the referee of the game. And this will help you think about the type of code we might put inside the game mode. Realistically speaking, you do not need to even write any code in the game mode. This is just how Unreal has set it up. The game mode becomes very, very useful, especially in multiplayer games or in much large-scale single-player projects. For our cases, you might not even put anything in the game mode. That is fine. We will see later on in the quarter a reason why you might want to, but for this project, largely we won't. However, there's one important thing that the game mode has that is important to know about, and that is that the game mode defines which pawn we spawn and which controller we spawn. There's two distinct things Unreal has. That's a pawn and a controller that come together to make our playable character. Let's just look at these two and then let's think about why Unreal would have made them separate. A controller does only one thing. It handles our inputs. Now, this could be input that comes from a human. This could be input that comes from your controller, your keyboard, etc. But really, this could be input that comes in from a human, or this could be inputs that come in from an AI. So we could, the AI doesn't, use a keyboard or use a controller. They just kind of tell the computer what they want to input. Well, that goes from the AI to the controller. When we as humans press a button on our input interface, it goes from our input into this character controller class. The character controller class then sends this input along to the pawn, which uses it. The pawn is the visual representation of our player. So when you think about a character or like a third-person character, they have a model, they got some animation, some effects. All of that comes into the pawn. The pawn also contains the logic for how the character is going to move. A player, like a human character, is going to move very differently to a vehicle, which might accelerate, decelerate much slower. A player, on the other hand, can change their directions very quickly. They could walk backwards, etc. The pawn is going to determine the logic. All the controller does is pass the input information onto the pawn. And the reason we might have different controllers is because we can have the exact same pawn controlled by a human or controlled by an AI. So just to visually look at this with a small example, you can look at this very nice drawing I have made. On the top, we have the controller. So if you think of something like a puppet, we have our little wooden piece with all the strings that we use with our hands to control. And so we as a human are putting inputs into those strings, and that input gets transferred down and it affects our pawn. So one reason Unreal separates this out, well, the main reason Unreal separates this out, is so that we can use the exact same controller. If we come down here, we can see we have the exact same controller, but here it's controlling a totally different pawn. And that's the major reason to have this, is we can control different types of pawns. In Unreal, we call it possessing. Our controller can possess different pawns that act very differently. But we only need to set up one controller to do such. To give you a practical example of this in Unreal itself, if you think about Fortnite, when we start the game, we only have one controller class, and that handles the input whether we're using a keyboard or whether we're using a controller like an Xbox controller. When we start the game, the character that we possess is kind of invisible. They're inside this battle bus, and the only control that it responds to is a button that tells the character to jump out. When we jump out, we possess a totally different character. This is our third-person character, and that falls to the ground. We can start running around, picking up weapons, etc. But Fortnite also has different vehicles that we can use. So there's things like a shopping cart or a car, for example. We still use the same controller, but when we enter that vehicle, we possess a new pawn. We possess a car. We possess the shopping cart. And the controls, while we're still using the exact same inputs, I'm using the same keyboard to input my controls, the car acts very differently from on-foot controls. Like, the car will accelerate, it'll turn much slower, it requires time to brake, it flies off of ramps and it jumps. And that's very different to the third-person controller, which cannot do any of that. It moves back, forward, left, right very quickly. It can jump using spacebar or A, etc. Main thing to know is one controller can control many pawns, and that's an important concept in Unreal. The reason we can use different controllers is, for example, I might have the same pawn controlled by me. I might have the same pawn controlled by an AI. So we can set up one pawn which has its movement logic, and then we can even have AI control that exact same pawn. Let's just take a look at how we could set this up in Unreal for our cases. So coming to Unreal, there's two ways to set up the game mode that we would like to use. We could either go Edit, Project Settings, Maps and Modes, and here we see Default Game Mode. It says Game Mode Base. This is just the basic game mode Unreal has. And setting it here will set it for every single level in the game. In our level, if I was to hit Window and open up World Settings, which is already open, you can see there is a Game Mode override. Currently it's set to None. When it is None, it's going to use whatever game mode we set in the project settings, in this case Game Mode Base, or we can change it here and that's going to override whatever our project settings is. This is again useful if for most of the levels we have one game mode and then maybe you have a lobby or an end game screen that uses a slightly different game mode. Sometimes our menus might use different game modes, so we'll just override it rather than setting it in the project. Let's make our own game mode to see what it's made out of. So I'm going to right click, Blueprint class, because everything is usually a blueprint. And you can see when it says pick parent class, we're not going to pick actor, so we're going to see Game Mode Base. We're going to click that, and then it lets us name it. Normally, by convention, all blueprints are named with or prefixed with BP. Game modes are slightly special. I like to personally name them GM for game mode, but you can name them BP if you want. That is still convention. Or just to like know that it's a specific type of blueprint, we can name it GM because that's a special type of blueprint and it represents game mode. So I'm going to call it GM first person. And this represents our first person game mode. Hit enter to open it. And you can see that it's just like any other blueprint. Traditionally speaking, in the game mode, we don't really use the viewport. We're not going to add any visual components to this. Again, remember the game mode just defines the rules. We can keep all this here, but let's really look at the details panel. If you don't see anything in your details panel, for example, or if you're seeing like, you accidentally clicked on one of the components and you're seeing its options, or you don't see anything, we just click this class defaults button to see the exact options that we want to look at. I will have a link in your resources that takes you to the Unreal documentation for game modes if you'd like to read further about it. I'm just going to focus on what is important for us to know. So underneath this classes section, this is the main thing. Remember we talked about the game mode defines the rules, but it also defines which player controller we're going to use and which player pawn we're going to use. That is all determined here. It has a bunch of things, game session state, game state class, and a whole bunch of classes that you can set here. Again, this should be in the resources under the Unreal documentation. I just don't want to overload you with information, so let's not worry about them. Let's just worry about what we need to, which is this player controller class and this default pawn class. So we can set the player controller here. We don't need to change this player controller. This default player controller class is going to handle our inputs just fine for what we want to use them for. What we do want to change, however, is this default pawn class, because we are going to make our own pawn. We're not going to handle Unreal's default character controller class handles inputs just fine for us. What we really want to handle is the default pawn class, because we want to make our own first person character. So let's just do that. Let's set up our own pawn and let's see it in action in the level. We're not going to put any code to it, so our pawn isn't going to do anything. It's not going to interact with anything. But we can see that we're going to be using our pawn, and let's just do that. So I'm going to start by docking my first person game mode and going back to the level. I can right click, add another blueprint class, and now here we can see those different things we talked about. There is a pawn, and we can read what it says. It says a pawn is an actor that can be possessed, we used that word earlier, and receive input from a controller. We have a player controller. A player controller is an actor responsible for controlling a player pawn used by the player. You can always click on these little question mark icons to open up the documentation. So you can see I clicked on that and it opened up this player controllers documentation. Unimportant, but good to know these are there. I always find it helpful to read Unreal's documentation to see what they're thinking. They might use words we're not familiar with yet, so it might be a little hard to understand, but it's a good habit to try and read these things. Anyway, like I said, let's not bother with the controller. We want a pawn. We want to create our own visual representation of our player, give it its own movement logic. I'm going to make a pawn. A pawn is just a blueprint. We don't give it a special name, so I'm just going to name it BP first person character. You can see the little icon for a pawn is a pawn from chess, which is kind of neat. I'm going to open this pawn up. And you can see it is just like any other actor. So we're not going to add any like movement code in here, but let's see our pawn in action. To do that, I'm going to use the wonderful print string, connect it up to our begin play, and I'm just going to say this is first person character. Let's make the duration very big so that it stays on screen, and let's compile it. Now, we're not going to drag the pawn out like we did with all our other blueprints. We can, but let's not do it that way instead. Instead, under my game mode overrides, I'm going to set the game mode that I have made, GM first person. And I'm going to open up the GM first person again. And under its default pawn class, I am going to change that to my BP first person character. So let's just think about that. The game mode, we have set it to GM first person. In the GM first person game mode, we have set the default pawn class to our first person character. Our first person character is going to print out something on begin play. There's a special actor in Unreal called player start. You'll find like the basic level always has one. All player start's going to do is when I hit play, it's going to replace itself with my default player pawn. So instead of placing player pawn down, we can place this player start. Again, a reason for this separation is in multiplayer games. You might have, 10 players, but we might want 100 different random spawns. We can just place 100 different player starts and let Unreal just randomly pick 10 for us. That's one of the reasons to use this. But it's good to know this is always there. We can always use player start. All it's going to do when I hit play is replace it. So let's hit play. So here's a small example. I hit simulate. We cannot use simulate when checking the player, because when we hit simulate, we don't possess the character, so nothing happened. But if I was to hit play this level in active level editor viewport, you can see I hit play. It prints this is first person character. I can't do anything. I can't walk. I can't move because my character has no code associated with it. But what we have seen now is how to set up Unreal's game mode, what a controller class and what a pawn class is, how to set up our own pawn class, associate the pawn with the game mode, and then associate the game mode with the level. This is going to be the workflow for our first person character as well. Thank you for watching.